Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Oscar from 1991. Now, this is a movie you've probably never heard of, and neither have I, actually, until fairly recently. Despite that, I can't actually remember how I stumbled upon it. I think it may have been because I was paging through some lists of actors and their prior work and stumbled upon this movie because it's got a surprisingly stacked cast for being a movie that you've probably never heard about. I found out later that part of that is also because this movie did really poorly when it first came out in 1991. And on the one hand, I sort of understand why, but on the other hand, I think that is a huge mistake. I hesitate to say this is a diamond in the rough, but it's certainly a sapphire, an emerald. I don't know. I'm gonna torture this metaphor, but this has got some surprisingly good qualities to it that I didn't expect out of a early '90s comedy starring Sylvester Stallone. This is an era that is full of a lot of kind of mediocre comedies, especially the ones starring actors trying to break out of their previous typecasting, especially action and those sorts of actors. So obviously, Stallone is one, probably the most famous, of course, being Schwarzenegger and his efforts to not be typecast solely as the muscle-bound hero. And those really are very hit and miss. If you've watched any of them, you've probably run into some that are good and some that are bad. In fact, I think did I watch a Schwarzenegger? I think I may have watched a Schwarzenegger on this show before. I'll have to go back and check. But they can be pretty good or pretty bad. If you just pitch to me at any time, whether in 1991 or now, that, hey, I'm going to make a period piece screwball comedy film starring Sylvester Stallone, I would have told you were insane, because this on its face seems like a terrible idea. It's a weird, bizarre choice across the board, but it turns into something that is surprisingly pretty good. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think this is incredible cinema or anything like that. I don't think it is breaking new barriers. I don't think it is an exemplar of the genres that it represents or anything like that. But there's some good stuff in here, and it's like an amusing movie that doesn't require a huge amount of brain power, but has some fun convolution to it. Stylistically, this is a comedy of errors. It's sort of a farce, and the whole point sort of being the absurdity of the scenario and the relationships between various actors. We've had a few movies previously on this show that have sort of fallen into that realm in terms of their style, but none that have been, I think, I would consider directly on the nose of being comedy of errors or a farce. And weirdly, this is like the closest thing that gets to it. This is also not a period of cinema history when those sorts of films were really being made. Farces and comedies of errors and even screwball comedies the first two were really sort of brought out of theater and stage plays, and the screwball comedy is sort of an evolution, to my mind, of that genre that sort of evolved in the 50s, 60s, 70s. The screwball comedy is something we've seen a little bit more in this show and things we've watched. But these are all genres that are sort of not being made into the 80s or 90s. The 80s and 90s start to see some new types of comedies that are in some ways attempting to modernize the idea of a screwball, but often do it pretty poorly and lead into a whole era of comedy films that are just very lowbrow and not clever and just sort of hinging on a lot of cheap laughs. So to see somebody attempt to make a film like this in the 90s at all, let alone with the cast that it did, is sort of impressive on its own. This is a John Landis film, and Landis was known throughout the 80s and 90s for making a lot of very good films. That said, apparently this movie did incredibly poorly, to the point that at one time or another, I think both Stallone and Landis have said they wish they didn't make it. I think they've come around to it in modern times a little bit more, but it was completely panned. And given that this was sort of a dead genre being revived in an era where people didn't know how to watch it, I'll put a pin in that phrase, but I can understand why this would have done poorly. If you are a 90s comedy movie watcher going into a movie like this, it doesn't fit with the watching style or the watching expectations of somebody who had been watching 80s and 90s comedies. This is a theatrical production in very many ways, to the point of this is actually based on I found this out after, based on a play from the 60s, I believe, which would have been appropriate. That's about the time those things were a lot more popular. So I can sort of understand at a base level why this wasn't super popular, and even why the critics of the time, not just the movie going public, but the critics as well, were not seeing this as what it is. This movie has quite the stacked cast. It's full of a whole lot of different characters, with the central character being played by Stallone. But that really doesn't give enough credit to the entire list of actors, both new and old, who are in this film. Donna Meche is a classic actor who's in stuff for probably 50 years before this. Tim Curry has a sizable role in this film, and Tim Curry is Tim Curry. He's incredible in everything. And I believe this is either the first movie starring or with Marissa Tomei, or one of her very early ones. It's funny actually. This has some minor parallels to a movie that is a great love of mine, My Cousin Vinny, and the idea of some of those parallels. The way it parallels is kind of fun. My Cousin Vinny is also a unique kind of comedy that hasn't really been done again after. But anyway, I digress. Not every performance in this film is incredible, but they're all workable. And really, that's enough. Because when it comes to an ensemble piece like this, a big theatrical production that is more about how everything synthesizes together, if there are small issues in the production or in the acting, you forget them very quickly, because the pacing of the production sort of skims right by them. But with that all said, like, while the acting is quite good, I think a lot of credit is also due to the stylization of the entire thing, because this is also a period piece. It's set in the 1931, I believe, right around the start of the Great Depression, or the continuation of the Great Depression, and sort of this. The whole setting there sets up a whole bunch of expectations. It's also based around Stallone being a former mobster who's trying to sort of get out of the mob for reasons that I won't get into all the details of. And some of the references, the historical references, and the uses of time and place to sort of contextualize all the behaviors and expectations work really well to bring a world to life that's not super detailed inherently, but is relying, well, not relying on, but enriched by having a little bit of contextual understanding of what big city in 1931 in the US was probably like. Gives you some leads and some understanding that's just kind of fun. There are a lot of things that are good about the overall production as well. I think this is a very pretty. It's a very pretty movie. It's theatrical again in its styling and its lighting. It's using very much stage lighting in its styles. There are a few scenes, a few shots here and there that are a little bit more naturalistic, but it's very theatrical. And they use the costuming and the sets to great effect. Almost the entire film is set in this one large house, and everybody's dressed richly, sometimes with multiple different costume changes throughout the show. I really want to call it a show because it's so theatrical. And so having these characters and these costume changes and this kind of silly mansion that everything's going around in, it almost starts to dip into, can't help but make the comparison with Tim Curry. It dips into sort of Clue area of just being that sort of like the house and everything around and how the house is used is as much a character as each of the characters at play. This is not like a super clever plot. It's not trying to baffle you or befuddle you. It's very much like a go with the flow plot of just there's an absurd thing here, and in the next scene there's going to be a new absurd thing, and we're going to keep tying them all together because sometimes it's just fun to watch these individual scenes go by and see how they play past each other and the characters play off each other as a result of these absurd scenarios. That said, there are a few things that I think it doesn't do perfectly for this genre. When it comes to theater in general, and especially a setting that is basically down to one house and a whole bunch of characters, and you're really playing off the banter between those characters, you key in on certain things more than usual. One of those being the pacing of that banter. Everybody needs to be, really, really I don't know if you can hear me snapping, but it has to be, excuse me, quick on their feet with the lines. And because this is a movie, you would hope that the forgiving nature of the editing process would allow you not to miss that as much. But there are at times, I wouldn't say any particular scene drags, but sometimes it's just a hair too slow. It feels like you're just a little bit ahead of the movie and you're like, oh, we see how this is playing out. There are a few jokes that just are beaten a little bit too hard, that it's just like, that, okay, we get it. It's not funny anymore. Let's move on to the next thing. And they do. And because of the nature of this style, nothing sticks around for more than a few minutes and you forget them quickly because there's so many other things to juggle. But overall, I think that this is like a pretty pleasant movie to watch. It's not poorly paced. It's just got a nice kind of light comedic tone with these little dips into different genres. And while it's by no means perfect, it's just fun. It's a heck of a lot better than I could think of any number of films I'd like to watch less than this. It's a hard thing to try and go to bat for a movie that is critically panned but is mostly just okay. But that's, I think, the best I can say for it is, or the the most direct way I can say that is there are movies coming out every year, lots of them, that are way worse than this. So if you just want some kind of light crime screwball comedy thing, this is pretty good. I'm really not disappointed with spending my time on this, and I don't think it deserves to get maligned the way it apparently has been historically. It's just kind of good fun. Anyway, I think that's about all I have to say about it. It's not super like, there's no one thing I want to pinpoint and like really gush about, but it's just good. Anyway, I'll stop talking now. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.